other, don't be an asshole, kind of stuff like that. You got to think about other people, not yourself, which is, totally not a polemic notion at all. What secular society has done, however, is it's removed Jesus and God from the equation, which accomplishes two things. One, it takes the spiritual force out of it, out of these ideas and this moral code. So it is essentially adrift. You can ask someone, well, why should I, be nice to people around me? And, if in a Christian paradigm, you can say, well, God says so, or Jesus says so. In a secular paradigm, you don't really have an answer. So people just come up with all these things like, oh, it's just common sense, or, it's just, we should because it's right, and there's no force behind that idea. So it's almost like a castration of the spiritual system. Because when there is still that link back to the spiritual system, you still have the esoteric thread to get back to a higher idea and sort of a higher sense of purpose and something like that. There's still something to grip onto, even sort of your most base form of Christianity, which can lead you back to something where you're actually coming up with ideas. Secularism completely cuts that off. There's no way to embrace that. And I think that that's very important for secular society to do. In a way, it's kind of religious freedom is a product of that. We have freedom of religion as long as we don't practice our religion too aggressively, and I don't even mean necessarily in terms of like going out door to door and bothering people. That's one thing. Just for a recent example, in Germany, they just made it illegal to have circumcision for religious reasons, which, I personally am not a fan of circumcision. I don't think people should have it done, but at the same time, unless it's medically necessary, at the same time, it seems troublesome to me that the government can tell people how to practice their religion. It doesn't jive well, and that sets us on a slippery slope down to, well, what else is going to become illegal, and at what point does this become a serious problem? And you see this in Europe a lot right now, because they're trying to promote atmosphere of religious freedom, but at the same time, it's more secularized even in North America. So you have problems with Muslim dress and stuff like that. In France, that was a big deal, where it became illegal to be veiled in public places because you can't be detected on camera or whatever, and you can hide stuff. And it's like, well, while I understand that concern, it's very difficult to legislate something like that without it becoming a question of the government deciding how people should practice their religion, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of religious freedom as a concept. And that's sort of what secular society ends up doing. Because the reality is, if you try to actually manifest your values, you are going to come into conflict with people. There are people who are not going to like what you do. You're going to get in fights, and there's going to be some kind of problem. But that's inevitable, because the only other option is not trying to manifest your values, which leaves you at the prey of everyone else who is trying to. This is the thing that I always come up against when people ask me, well, what gives you the right to do this or say that? It's like, well, if I don't, someone else will. Like, if everyone else sits back and just lets the assholes decide what goes on, then, the assholes run the world, which looks remarkably like the world that we have now. So I think that what the key thing about this secular idea and why it becomes so pernicious is that it allows the existence of these values to become covert. And this actually sort of helps that idea of corruption along quite a bit. Because the more something is swept under the rug, and the more something is something you're not directly allowed to talk about, the more it's possible to allow really crazy ideas to creep into really interesting places. Like, if you look at America, for example, this very small population of the country is actually fundamentalist Christian. They're very loud, and they're very vocal, and they're on TV a lot, but if you look at the actual numbers, there aren't really that many of them. They just make good press. However, quite a few of the presidents of the United States in the last couple decades have been fundamentalist Christians. Why is that? I mean, in an atmosphere of religious tolerance, it's because it's not legitimate to question a presidential candidate on their religious views. It would be seen as some kind of discrimination. So then you get people with really crazy ideas who are never called on those really crazy ideas in a public setting, so they get to go on and be elected with these crazy ideas that a lot of people don't even realize that they have, or maybe they heard about it through someone else and they're not really sure how into it they are or whatever. Whereas if you let a lot of these guys talk about what they really believe for a short period of time, I think a lot of people would be like, So you can't, and which this plays back into the whole nature of the devils themselves. I mean, why are they worshipped as the gods of these religions by the people who are worshiping these religions? Well, it's because, and I will make the distinction too between the four great devils as they're described in Luke 14 And Crowley talks about these ideas in different ways at different times. I mean, he has very positive things to say about Satan in different periods, which has led him to be labeled as a Satanist, which is fair enough, whatever. But but I think that that's a different context for those remarks and a different sense in which he's referring to these ideas, because there's kind of the concept of a devil as an opposition to the thing that exists, which is actually not what the four great devils described in Liber 418 do. They're not opposed to what exists. In fact, they're invested in perpetuating it as much as possible, because what is right now is works out for them. I'm not sure. When we talk about the progression of the eons, and this is something that I think that when people look at this, they should think about and ask themselves this question. And I'm not going to tell people what to think about it necessarily, but the question is, does this get resolved? In Liber 14 was shown that the slave gods are overthrown at a certain point, and Crowley expects that to ripple out and have a larger social effect. But it's also pretty clear in the Book of the Law. I think that's part of the reason Aiwass says, ye are against the people, O my chosen. There's never a point at which these sort of fundamental esoteric truths are going to be apprehensible to the public at large or society at large. There's always going to be people that take these ideas and run to a psychotic place with them, as we're going to see when we get into this demonology stuff in a minute here. They have the potential to do that, and that is often something that happens when people start to get invested in the occult, and they start to be exposed to new ideas and spiritual experiences, and you see a lot of people just kind of rush right off and feel like they have the new truth, when the actuality is kind of like the old stuff that they had before, and they need to calm down and just do a little more. The thing is that this lasting change, real lasting change, doesn't happen easily. Like Heidegger observes with humanism, things keep creeping back in and creeping back in. Old habits die hard, so to speak. There's a very interesting book called Icarus Fallen by a French political philosopher, Chantal Delsol, where she talks about black market ideologies, and she makes a comparison to the drug trade as well, or you can make a comparison to prohibition just as easily. Let's go with prohibition. During the period of prohibition, the alcohol that was sold was a great deal more expensive than it would have been otherwise, and it was usually adulterated with substances that would make you more sick than actually drinking that much alcohol. The quality was lower, and it was all because it created an atmosphere of violence and crime. And these are all symptoms of the fact that it was prohibited, it was made illegal, and it created a black market situation. And Chantal Delsol says, this happens with ideologies too, which brings us into the fundamentalist Christian president. If these religious ideas are a black market in the political climate, you can go out and say, yes, I'm a Christian, I go to church, but you don't talk about it in depth. You don't say the phrase, you get called on it, or called on what it means to you, stuff like that. And that allows these more extreme ideas to creep in under the radar because they're not being officially recognized, they're not part of the official sort of milieu or system. So, in light of this idea, evil is error, and I said I wanted to talk about demonology. So, what does this imply to us about demons? Are demons evil, really, or are they? Do they fit the Thelemic definition of evil? Do they fit another definition of evil? Maybe, but we like them. They're our buddies. Well, these are interesting questions. I mean, I've worked with the Goetia myself for well over a decade. I've had successful work and less successful work. It's been exciting, anyway. But one thing I will say is that what seems to jive with me between Goetic spirits and the way that they work and the idea of evil is error is that when they do seek to manifest the results of a working, when you've told them to do something and they're going off trying to bring it to you or whatever, it usually happens, I have noticed, because something goes wrong somewhere else. Not because there's a shake-up or mix-up or something, and that's usually the vehicle for the manifestation. And this is just me talking from my experience. It's not, I would recommend that if people want to analyze that idea or sort of compare the idea, ask the question, are the demons evil by comparison with this idea that evil is error? Well, work with the Goetia and see how the results manifest themselves and sort of use your own judgment to come up with a conclusion based on that. But this, it's important in many ways, though, just as we get into the subject, to make sure that our terms are